Major support for Carolina Business Review provided by Grant Thornton. Operating in more than 100 countries, our tax, audit, and advisory professionals specialize in helping companies unlock their growth potential. Colonial Life, providing benefits to employees to help them protect their family, their finances, and their futures. And Sonoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services with more than 300 operations in 35 countries.
The affordable housing issue is not a new phenomenon. Less than a generation ago, we would use terms like Section 8 homes, the projects, or low-income housing. I'm Chris William, and welcome again to the most widely watched source of Carolina business policy and public affairs, seen each and every week across the Carolinas for 28 years now. Thank you for supporting this dialogue. Affordable housing shows up as one of the most talked about issues in communities and troubling issues, not because there are more families that may qualify for poverty level, that may be so, but because affordable housing is becoming more mainstream. Harder and harder, even for middle class, to make rent. Basic questions would be, of course, why? What does it take now to afford a home? Is what your parents called subsidized housing fair? Or is this issue much more conventional now? In a moment, a panel of leaders from across our region who seem to be meeting this issue head on. Stay with us.
Gratefully acknowledging support by Martin Marietta, a leading provider of natural resource-based building materials, providing the foundation upon which our communities improve and grow. Blue Cross Blue Shield of South Carolina, an independent licensee of the Blue Cross and Blue Shield Association. Visit us at southcarolinablues.com. The Duke Endowment, a private foundation enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. Barings, a leading global asset management firm dedicated to meeting the evolving investment and capital needs of its clients. Learn more at barings.com. On this edition of Carolina Business Review, Charlotte Mayor Vi Lyles, Mayor Stephen K. Benjamin of Columbia, South Carolina, Brika Eklund of the Self-Help Credit Union, and Michael Marsicano of the Foundation for the Carolinas.
Welcome again to our program, gentlemen, ladies. Thank you for being here. Mayor Lyles, let's start with you. You know, this issue, we use the term affordable housing so easily and we throw it around, but does this need to be defined? Do we all need to have the same definition, and what is the definition?
You know, the federal government has a definition. It'll say no more than 30% of your income should be dedicated to the availability of living, rental, or ownership. But I think with the change in the culture of our country, where people are flocking to the urban areas, we've got to look at it differently. The way I describe it is that if you're working in Charlotte, you ought to be able to afford to live in Charlotte. And I say that because we have public employees, teachers, firefighters, police officers, and that 30% isn't possible for them in our community as we're growing, and you see this increasing cost of housing and the value of living in an urban community. So what I say is that we need to have housing that allows people to live comfortably in a place. I want a diverse community. That means we have to look at everyone differently and say, what can we do best to provide them adequate, safe housing?
So, Mayor Benjamin, different town, same issues, but I want to ask you the same question. As Mayor Lyles describes what affordable housing is for Charlotte, or her definition, does it need to be standardized? Is it the same for you? Is there something else here that gets lost in translation if it's not?
Sure. I appreciate Mayor Lyles' characterization because it goes straight to the values question. Are we a city for all people? Are we making sure that we're building cities, craftily building cities that speak to that central question? If you can work in the city and help build the city, can you live in the city? And I think that ought to drive our discussion. The challenge is that old perceptions will have folks believing that affordable housing is the image of Cabrini Green projects in Chicago. And the reality is, if you get around this city in Charlotte or in Columbia or in cities all across America right now, and you see what workforce housing looks like, affordable housing looks like, with a fantastically executed 9% or 4% credit, tax credit project looks like. These are excellent homes. I mean, thoughtful, mixed use, mixed income communities that I would love to live in. I mean, so getting people past these ideas as to what affordable housing means is a major challenge. The reality is that all of our communities, all of our cities are much richer, much more thoughtful. I don't think standardization is necessarily key, because even within our city, you have incredibly different communities in a city. The city's not a perfectly carved box by a cartographer recognizing political differences across the country. We're natural living entities or organisms, and it's our job as civic leaders to try and make sure that we get very creative. We try to strike thoughtful public-private partnerships, that we pull in philanthropy when we can, and we create opportunities for people to live up to their full potential, and we can do that.
Yeah, Michael.
Chris, to give you a number that might help folks get a clearer picture, 79% of the citizens in Mecklenburg County who earn $50,000 or less are spending more than 30% on housing. That's cost burden. 79% under 50,000. Now you put a face to that 50,000, and we are talking, as Mayor Lyles said, teachers, police persons, firemen and women. This is not just the poorest among us that are struggling with housing.
Is it a financing question?
I think it definitely is, and I think that goes in.
And I'm sorry, Brika,
Sure.
Is it a financing from a political institution, or is it a personal financing question?
Well, I think that depends on the diversity of the population that we're talking about that needs different types of housing. So extremely cost-burdened individuals who are spending 50% or more of their income on housing need different financial resources to help them stabilize their housing. Things like housing choice vouchers and project-based rental assistance through housing authorities. That is a very federal and state and local public subsidy resource that is going to help those individuals stay in affordable housing. When you start to talk about 60% area median income, folks in this city who are in Charlotte who are making $60,000, $70,000 as a household, there are more options within the private sector to help those individuals find housing. And the issues there more are around local zoning, philanthropic sources, and others that can really come in and allow the private market the right to develop density, the right to develop townhomes and smaller scale houses that some zoning doesn't allow.
So, Mayor Benjamin, you talk about it from the Midlands and Columbia's point of view. Is it more acute in places like Florence, Aiken, Conway, et cetera, et cetera? Are those... So you have a certain issue in Columbia for sure, but does it, as you get closer and closer to the rural communities, is it harder? Or do you know?
Well, no, I spent a great deal of time. I just wrapped up my tenure as president of the U.S. Conference of Mayors, and I stay actively involved, speaking with my colleagues all across the country and certainly across our great state often. The challenges that Mayor Lyles mentioned, and we're seeing this incredible urbanization of our communities. Metropolitan economies now account for 85.5% of all people, 89% of our of jobs, and over 92% of GDP is now created in cities and metro areas. People are flocking in, and it's creating some major issues, and certainly it creates a separate set of issues for rural communities. What I'd like to see, and I see everywhere I go, and what we do as mayors is we find really great ideas that have been executed. We steal them, and we scale them up, we scale them down. Is a creativity that's happening on the local level to try and create opportunities for people to live well and live with dignity and have shelter and give their children a chance to participate in the American economic experiment. We've had some fantastic successes on the local level in Columbia by working with our private sector. We decided several years back that we would take our community development block grant funding, sequester that funding for a couple of years, and use it as a second mortgage, working with 6 banks. The banks provide 80% of loans for folks who want to buy their homes. We provide the second 20%. We provide that at a much lower interest rate, so the blended rate is good. Banks only loaning 80%, so there's no PMI, and we're allowing people to buy homes with a very low down payment, as low as $500 or $1,000, up to $2,000. We now have a loan portfolio of over $125 million, a default rate less than 1%. So the question, back to the question about finances, it's amazing what hardworking people can do with very little money if you give them an opportunity to live well. Our folks are taking advantage of it. And that's just one example, literally, of hundreds or thousands of programs all around the country that pull in private sector support, philanthropic support, public support, and us using the levers that we have as public policymakers to create opportunities for hardworking Americans.
So, you know, Chris, one of the things that Steve talks about is the ability to have autonomy at the local level. And I can't tell you how important it is. If we were going to work with the federal government.
I'm sorry, ma'am, you mean autonomy from the federal government's funding or state funding?
From the federal government funding, because we compete with rural areas. The need for housing is evident across the entire state of North Carolina. So in Charlotte, we actually get 2 of maybe 10 applications that we might make every 6 months for federal funding. That's not enough to keep up with the urbanization that's going on. So we need to figure out how to do this differently. And Michael and I started 18 months ago thinking about, if we're going to have economic mobility in Charlotte, if we're really going to talk about this as a holistic problem of jobs, housing, and transportation, we've got to do something different. And we created a program around local bond funding, philanthropic gifts and donations, as well as the banking expertise that Steve is using in Columbia. We're bringing in our banks to do the same thing here in Charlotte. And as a result of that, we have about $100 million that we're working on right now to determine how do we actually make a difference in the ability to have an affordable place to live. And I say this all the time, if you think that this housing is a separate issue, it's not. You've got to consider, if your workers are 2 hours outside of work, what does that mean? You're going to build a road? Are you going to build a transit system for them to get into the city? It's an impact that focuses on where our jobs are and how people can manage a lifestyle. We often say, you know, people need to be with their families. Well, a 2-hour commute every day, one way, 4 hours,
Sure.
And you can't complain about someone that says, well, I didn't have time to work for my kids on their homework.
And I think
they're on a bus or a train or in a car.
This housing partnership that we have between philanthropy and the city comes from the Leading on Opportunity report that our citizens put together after 18 months of study on the economic opportunity and urban mobility issues. And just to make a point on transportation, one of the major recommendations in that report was to move to a grid system from a hub and spoke system, and that has already cut the commute times for families 20 and 30 minutes by just moving the transportation system to a new. So it is it's got to be a holistic approach to it.
Go ahead and finish your thought, and I want to come back to something on financing with you, Michael.
Yeah, I'd just like to add in that 47% of the families that commute into Charlotte to work make $40,000 or less per the Census, U.S. Census Bureau. It's not just that groups of people are coming into our metropolitan areas to work, it's the income level of those individuals. And these are individuals that don't have as much income to spend on different types of housing closer to the city or the transportation, and have even less disposable income for other things like healthcare and school supplies, et cetera. And so I think it's important for us to understand, with that rural and urban connection, a lot of the individuals who are commuting into our urban areas are lower income and face different housing burdens than urban affordable housing problems.
Michael, back to this, thank you. I'm not glossing over that, Brika, but I want to get back to this point. So, Mayor Lyles, you talked about the Foundation for the Carolinas in the city working together on the financing part of this. And Michael, my best guess at this point was in-kind, cash, commitments, and individual donations. Have you over $200 million committed to this idea right now?
If you add reduced lending into that,
okay,
absolutely.
So all of this in kind. How much would it take to fix that problem across the board in a town like Charlotte?
Oh, we're talking
way more than 200.
A billion?
We're talking
Billions.
over $1 billion, absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
Mayor Benjamin, how do you, and you've been very eloquent about the challenges in Columbia, how do you make sure that this doesn't become politically weaponized and turn into some not just tit for tat, but then it turns into a partisan issue. How do you make sure, given all of the things that you have to touch around financing, around poverty level, around transportation, that this debate about defining affordable housing as it is in Columbia doesn't become politically weaponized?
Try not to weaponize anything politically. That's not what we do, at least not mayors do. What we try to do is try to look at this as being an essential piece of American infrastructure. I mean, all across this country, we have a great infrastructure deficit. Depending on how you define it, I count housing in here. It's probably somewhere between $2 and $3 trillion deficit. One key way to aggressively address that, and I characterize it as an infrastructure discussion because it tends to be one unifying way to bring people on both. There used to be two sides of the aisle, there are about 20 sides of the aisle now, but on all sides of the aisle together. Addressing America's infrastructure deficit and coming up with a thoughtful Marshall Plan to try and address these needs all across our communities. That does require a significant partnership with the federal government. And it's so important we say this. We talk about partnership. 75% of all infrastructure is financed by state and local governments, not by the federal government. In critical infrastructure like water, sewer, 98.5% state and local governments, not by the federal government. The federal government has been MIA. When we talk about federal support, we're actually talking about repatriating our tax dollars back home. So this is not money falling like manna from heaven.
Yeah.
We want to see thoughtful, strategic investments from the federal government and making sure that Americans have a chance to participate in the 21st century economy without having to worry about the income volatility and the various challenges that families are facing right now. And the greatest and most powerful and wealthiest democratic nation in the history of the world. We can do better. So I think you have to continue to speak back to your question in edifying terms and in ways that unify people and treat this as infrastructure and devote not only the financing schemes but also the funding to make it happen.
Michael said something, Mayor Lyles, about transportation makes a big impact in this area. We'll use your town. If Charlotte gets a transportation plan that's salient, that's deployable, that everyone agrees on, and there are either more toll lanes or more toll roads, or there's another ring around Charlotte and it's done well, how much would that go to alleviate affordable housing issues? Would it be a big hit? A big plus?
It is a big plus. You think about any of us having a commute time and what it takes. And it's all down to when we talk about this American dream and what we're trying to get people to participate in, it is about work. So if we're going to provide opportunities for people to get to work in a reasonable amount of time and to get home in a reasonable amount of time, I think that's the American dream. Because that's the only way we can work to do these things. And if you're sitting in traffic, I think Steve and I would agree, if you're on I-77 between Columbia and Charlotte and you can't get home, it does make a difference. So yes, we need to look at other options for transportation. And I'm really fortunate, I think, that we're living in a time of technology and change where we can use technology to help model what works best. Is it bus rapid transit? Is it bus, ways that are just really able to move through the city well? Is it our fixed rail line? And is it the last mile drive that we use technology or maybe private companies to implement for us? So transportation is, I think, our next big challenge for economic mobility.
If we're assigning priorities to the solution for affordable housing, the affordable housing challenge, and I'm going to ask you to answer this too. Michael, what is the biggest challenge? Is it zoning? Is it land use? Is it land acquisition? Is it developers dropping their cost? I mean, what would be the biggest thing that could drop to help this issue?
Well, first let me address what I think the headwinds are. The cost of land is skyrocketing. And so too is the cost of construction. And when you add those two together, the ability for builders to build affordable housing that doesn't require rent or mortgage rates has really compromised this issue. It's why the affordable housing crisis has increased, particularly in workforce development. I think the greatest challenge, though, is public will.
Really?
We have been fortunate in Charlotte that the public has voted in bonds going from $15 million to $50 million at a very high percentage.
69%. I just want to say,
69%
I thank
approval
our
rating.
voters every day for that.
Right. But where that affordable housing is placed has a lot of backlash. And so we need to not concentrate affordable housing in certain parts of our community or any community in North Carolina. We need to have mixed income housing, as you have suggested, Mayor, across our community. And a lot of people have this notion, as you suggested up front in your preamble, that the projects, there's a generation that sees affordable housing as something very different than it is today. Most affordable housing is well designed, it's attractive looking, and yet there's this attitude that it is not something you want in your backyard. And that's got to change.
Brika, how do you come down on that?
Yeah, I'm going to actually add to a couple of Michael's because I actually think it isn't just one solution. This is a really complicated problem. And I think there's two additionals. Income. A lot of issues around housing are the wage stagnation.
That's true.
Wages have increased, but the housing prices, because of the items that Michael mentioned, housing prices are increasing faster, rents are increasing faster than wages. And it's just really difficult for anyone up until about middle income to keep up with that. And then the other piece is the need for the local communities to do the type of innovative, important bond financing that is happening in communities like Charlotte and in Durham. There will be a $95 million bond initiative, thanks to Mayor Steve Schewel and the City Council in November. And that
Specific to affordable housing?
Specific to affordable housing, $95 million for affordable housing. And that does come from the public will that has really risen up in Durham in the last really just 5 years in terms of really gaining traction in the political realm.
Do you get the sense there's a public will for public finance around affordable housing in Columbia?
Yes, I think around what we have done locally, working with our county council, we passed some ordinances recently that allow us to work together to sequester prospective tax revenues to dump them into mixed income projects, and we've seen some success there. We are seeing a much more robust use of the 4% bond funding through the state government.
The impact investing?
Well, not
tax credit program.
tax credit program. Yes, yeah. So, which also I think one minor change would be actually changing the name of the low-income housing tax credit. I think that gets people really wound up, and the reality is that again, some of this housing is pretty doggone nice. So working much more closely on the local level with innovative tools, but certainly having the resources as the voters in Durham will vote for and the voters in Charlotte have, would certainly make it a lot easier.
And I don't know how South Carolina works as far as the state relationship with the communities, but in North Carolina we also have headwinds with state law. Let me give you just one small example.
The rent control type
well, lots of different things. And the one example I want to give you is actually on evictions. So in North Carolina, if you have a threatened eviction, but do not get evicted, you get your act together and you pay your rent, that eviction notice is on your record forever. That is state law. So when you go to get to the next apartment you're going to try to lease, you have this record of having notice of eviction, even though you were never evicted. There are simple things that we can do at the state level to change this whole area of affordable housing. That's an easy change, and yet we cannot get that through the state legislature. We have expunged DUIs in North Carolina, and we can't get eviction notices off people's records when they haven't even been evicted. So there's a lot that the state can do.
Michael brings up the kinds of things that we have best taken for granted. Well, yes, this is the way you can do it. You know, like if you had a felony arrest, well, you can't get a rental unit. And that's something that stands in the way of us getting people back as a productive part of our community. And with the new federal legislation and prison reform, we're going to have a number, thousands of people coming back to our communities with felony records. And if we say, well, you can't rent, what are we going to do with that population that's coming here that we want them to be able to work and do things differently. We can't build our way out of this affordable housing projects, no matter how many millions we put in. As you said, even $1 billion, it probably would continue. We now have to start thinking going forward, what are those things that we've just generally accepted as the status quo, that, you know, evictions, that we don't rent to people that are re-entering society, that every time you go and apply for an apartment, your credit check costs $25.
Sure, and it's prohibitive. Yeah.
And it's prohibitive from making a better situation.
I hate to cut you off, Your Honor, but we are literally out of time. Thank you for being so public spoken about it and public leadership on it to all of you. Michael, nice to see you. Mayor Benjamin, glad to have you back on the program. Brika, good to see you.
Thank you.
Until next week, I'm Chris William. If you have any questions or comments, carolinabusinessreview.org. Have a nice weekend. Good night.
Major funding for Carolina Business Review provided by Martin Marietta, Colonial Life, the Duke Endowment, Barings, Grant Thornton, Sonoco, Blue Cross Blue Shield of South Carolina, and by viewers like you. Thank you. Promotional consideration provided by Business North Carolina Magazine. For more information, visit carolinabusinessreview.org.